Just a few weeks ago, a government quietly tried to put a tracking chip inside every computer in America, not a literal chip. Something worse. A rule buried inside a bill that would have forced every operating system, every app store, every piece of software you've ever installed to check your identity before letting you use it. They called it Senate Bill 26,051. They said it was about protecting children. But here's the part nobody told you. The way this law was written, it wouldn't have just affected Apple and Google and Microsoft. It would have reached into a corner of the internet that almost nobody outside the tech world even knows exists. A free open system that millions of people quietly switched to because they got tired of being watched. And this law, as written, could have made that system illegal to even give away. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how close this came to happening, who stopped it, and why this exact fight is going to happen again in a state near you. This is the story of Senate Bill 26,051, and how a handful of volunteer programmers beat the government of an entire state. If stories like this, where ordinary people quietly outmaneuver a system that wasn't built to be questioned, are the kind of thing you want to keep seeing, hit subscribe before we go further. Now, let's get into exactly what this bill tried to do. Let's slow down and break this down in plain English, because the bill itself is written like a legal maze on purpose. Senate Bill 26,051 wanted to force every operating system, that's the software that runs your whole computer, like Windows or Apple's Mac OS, to label every user by age group: under 13, 13 to 15, 16 to 18, adult, and not just the operating system, app stores too. Every app you download would need to know instantly which age bracket you fall into. On paper, that sounds reasonable. Protect kids from harmful content, right? But here's the question almost nobody in the legislature seems to have asked before writing this. How do you verify age at the operating system level without identifying every single adult too? Think about what that actually requires. Your computer would need some kind of permanent record of who you are, just to turn it on and use it normally. Not just kids, everyone. You, a 68-year-old retired man who just wants to check his email and watch the news, would now be carrying a digital identity tag inside your own machine. And once that infrastructure exists, once the technical capability to verify identity at the OS level is built into law, it doesn't go away when the politicians who proposed it leave office. Infrastructure like this tends to stay and expand. Now here's an honest question worth sitting with. Not an accusation, just a question. Who would actually benefit if every computer required identity verification to function? Companies that already collect your data as part of their business model wouldn't have much to lose. They're already doing some version of this. The harder question is what happens to the kind of software that was never built to collect anyone's data in the first place. And that's exactly where this story gets strange. Here's where this bill ran into something the lawmakers clearly didn't expect. There's a kind of software most people over 60 have genuinely never had to think about, called open source software. Let me explain it the simplest way I can. Imagine a recipe, not a recipe owned by a restaurant chain, locked in a vault, protected by lawyers. A recipe that anyone in the world is allowed to copy, cook, change, and hand to their neighbor, completely free forever. Now imagine millions of people across the planet, total strangers, all improving that same recipe together with no company running the kitchen. That's open source software. The most famous example is something called Linux, a free operating system that has no single owner, no headquarters, no CEO sitting in a boardroom, no customer service line. It's maintained by volunteers, hobbyists, and engineers scattered across dozens of countries, all contributing pieces of code for free. Why does this matter to this story? Because Senate Bill 26,051 was written so broadly that it didn't just apply to Microsoft and Google. The legal language was wide enough to potentially capture free code repositories, websites like GitHub, where millions of these recipes are stored, and even systems like Docker, which package software so it runs the same way on any computer. Now picture trying to enforce this law in that world. A retired engineer in Berlin posts a piece of free software online as a hobby. Under this bill's original wording, would he be legally required to verify the age of every person on Earth who downloads it? There's no company to send the fine to, no office to inspect, no CEO to call into a hearing. Just a global, decentralized network of volunteers who never agreed to any of this. This is the part of the story where the lawmakers' good intentions ran straight into a wall they didn't know existed. So who actually stood up and stopped this? This wasn't some massive corporation with a legal department the size of a small army. This was a much smaller, much scrappier group, and that's exactly what makes this story worth telling. At the center of it was Carl Ritschl, the CEO of a company called System 76, which builds computers specifically designed to run this free open software. Ritschl didn't just write an angry letter. He went directly to the lawmakers in Colorado and explained in detail exactly what this bill would actually do once it left the page and met reality. He wasn't alone. The Linux Foundation, an organization that represents this entire open source community, also raised the alarm, publicly criticizing the idea of identity verification baked into the operating system itself. Their argument was simple and frankly hard to argue against. You cannot regulate something that has no center. Open source software is built specifically to be copied, forked, and spread without any single point of control. There is no company to hold accountable because there is no company. And here's the moment this story turns. Faced with that argument, faced with the reality that this law was, as written, basically unenforceable against an entire category of free software used by millions, the lawmakers in Colorado didn't dig in. They didn't double down. They quietly rewrote the bill. If you've been enjoying how this story keeps turning, this is a good moment to make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is the part almost nobody is talking about yet. Colorado lawmakers released an amendment to Senate Bill 26,051, and the language in it is worth paying close attention to. The new wording specifically carves out an exemption for software that can be, quote, "I copied, redistributed, and modified," almost word for word, describing how open source projects work. It goes further, explicitly mentioning free, publicly available code repositories and containerized software distribution. In other words, this isn't speculation anymore. This isn't online rumor. The actual legal text of the bill was changed because of pressure from this small community of developers and one persistent CEO. Let that sink in for a second. A government body, midway through passing legislation, looked at the technical reality presented to them by outside experts and admitted they'd gotten it wrong, at least for this one category of software. That almost never happens. Most of the time, when a law turns out to be poorly written, it doesn't get fixed before it passes. It gets passed anyway, and the damage gets sorted out in court years later at enormous cost to ordinary people. This time, the correction happened before the damage was done. But before you breathe too easy, because there's something important in what this victory did, and just as important in what it didn't do. Let's talk about that next. Here's the honest, sober truth, and I think it's more important than the celebration. Senate Bill 26,051 is not dead. It's still moving through the legislative process. Only one specific piece was carved out, the open source exemption. The core idea behind the bill, mandatory age and identity signals at the operating system and app store level, is still alive, still being debated, still potentially on track to become law for everything except the small, free, decentralized corner of software that managed to make its case in time. So what actually happened here isn't the government backed off. What happened is narrower and in some ways more interesting. A government ran directly into a technical reality it hadn't accounted for and was forced to make an exception for the one category of software where enforcement was genuinely, provably impossible. Everywhere else, every app store, every mainstream operating system, every piece of commercial software most people actually use day to day, this kind of identity verification requirement is still very much on the table. And here's the open question worth sitting with, the one I raised earlier. If laws like this move forward everywhere except the free, no company to regulate alternative, what happens to the appeal of that alternative over time? I'm not going to tell you the answer because I don't think anyone fully knows it yet. But it's worth asking out loud instead of pretending it isn't a question at all. If you think the story ends at the Colorado state line, I'd encourage you to look a little closer. Colorado is not the only state considering laws like this. Similar proposals, using similar language about age verification at the device level, are already circulating in other state legislatures across the country. There's also growing discussion at the federal level about some version of the same idea. And this pattern, a law introduced under the banner of protecting children that quietly expands to cover identity verification for every adult too, is not unique to the United States. Versions of this conversation are happening in the UK, in the European Union, and elsewhere. Here's the pattern worth remembering because it tends to repeat itself. Laws built around protecting children are, almost by design, very difficult for any politician to vote against publicly. Nobody wants to be the lawmaker who voted no on protecting kids. But that's exactly what makes this category of legislation worth reading closely instead of taking at face value, because the protective framing and the actual mechanism written into the bill aren't always the same thing. This particular bill, in this particular state, got caught and corrected, at least partially because a small, organized, technically fluent community pushed back fast with specifics before the bill became law. That's not guaranteed to happen every time. And it raises a real question for the next version of this fight, wherever it shows up next. Who's actually reading these bills closely enough to catch the next one before it passes? So let's bring this all the way back down to something practical, because that's ultimately what matters. What happened in Colorado is a genuinely useful case study in how legislation actually gets shaped, not by abstract debate, but by specific people showing lawmakers in concrete terms exactly how a bill's wording would play out in the real world. Carl Richel didn't win this by shouting. He won it by explaining. The Linux Foundation didn't win it with outrage. They won it by pointing at the actual sentence in the bill and saying, here's why this specific phrase doesn't work. That matters because it tells you something about how to actually push back against legislation you're worried about. Not with vague anger, but with specific, factual objections delivered to the people writing the bill before it's finalized. That's a slower, less satisfying story than the government got destroyed. But it's the true one, and frankly, it's more useful to understand than a fantasy version would be. The honest conclusion here isn't good triumphed over evil and now it's safe. The honest conclusion is, a flawed law met a group of people who understood the technical reality well enough to force a correction on one narrow point, while the broader law keeps moving forward. That's a partial win. Partial wins are still worth knowing about and worth learning from, because the next bill in the next state is already being drafted right now, and it almost certainly won't make the same mistake twice, which is exactly the part of the story we haven't covered yet. What the next version of this law might look like once lawmakers learn from this one. That's a conversation for another video. If this kind of close, fact-based look at how laws actually get written and unwritten is useful to you, subscribe, because this fight isn't close to finished, and we'll be tracking exactly where it shows up next.